Developing a cover crop management plan that is tailored to your specific farm circumstances, your location, your goals, your challenges, and so forth is really important for success. Today we'll look through the decisions you'll have to make when implementing cover crops on your farm and examine the considerations that will help you lead to the right decision for your specific operation. Perhaps more importantly, we're also going to show you some free online tools that can help you work through these management decisions and have the best success with cover crops for your farm. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Austin Minker. I'm the Extension Associate for Conservation Agronomy at NC State. My program focuses on cover crops, more specifically cover crop management. We have launched a cover crop portal, so if you want more information on the topics we cover today and some additional topics as well, definitely check that out. So let's get started. Cover crop benefits. Why would we be interested in taking on this additional cost for our farm? Well, they must generate certain types of benefits. This list of benefits we'll go over. It's certainly not exhaustive and it's not in any particular order. It's kind of the heavy hitters, what we see growers most interested in. Starting out with soil organic matter. This is a heavily cited, heavily stated goal with cover crops, improving our soil organic matter. Cover crops can influence soil organic matter by adding residue into our soils, contributing to microbial populations, and protecting the organic matter that's already there. That being said, there's a ton of variability in the rate at which we can expect this result and how much exactly we can influence our soil organic matter through cover crops. When we look at North Carolina specifically, we are in the southeast. We have a warmer, more humid climate. Because of that, we tend to have lower organic matter anyway, and we have seen that it can be a little bit more challenging for us to add organic matter through practices like cover crops. We have seen through studies at NC State that yes, we can increase organic matter through cover crops, but it may be a longer process for us compared to somewhere like the Midwest with a cooler climate, and you maybe see some more rapid, impressive studies showing a rapid increase in organic matter. Erosion prevention. Cover crops can greatly, reduce the amount of erosion we experience in our fields. If we look at a conventional rotation, we have an extended period of time where our fields are left bare or fallow, that soil is particularly susceptible to erosion, both from wind and water. Having that vegetative growth on that field during the off season can greatly reduce erosion and, preserve some of our precious topsoils. Soil moisture, we've seen from studies, fields with cover crop adoption have both improved water infiltration and holding capacity. Weed suppression is a growing interest with cover crops, especially with the onset of herbicide resistance. Cover crops can combat weeds in a number of ways. While they're alive, they'll compete for resources, both while they're alive and if you leave that cover crop residue on the surface, that can help to shade out weeds and decrease their germination and early establishment. And then certain cover crops, mainly cereal rye, we're learning may possess some allelopathic chemical compounds that can help decrease weed germination in the field. Biodiversity is, a bit of a broader kind of goal benefit here, but if we look at our soils as an ecosystem, plants are what feed that ecosystem, starting with the root exudates that feed the microbial population, and it all kind of expands from there. Again, if we have an extended period of time where our fields are left bare, we are essentially starving out that ecosystem for that, several months or whatever. Having a cover crop in there can just improve both the abundance and overall diversity in our soil ecosystems. And we've learned a lot in recent years about how important this ecosystem is for soil function, improve things like nutrient availability and so forth, but also enhanced resiliency. The more diverse and robust an ecosystem is, the better it's able to handle outside shocks like weather extreme and not lose as much function. Soil compaction could be an issue you're experiencing, and cover crops can certainly be a tool to help combat it. They tend to have a much more extensive root system than our cash crops that can help break up and alleviate some of that compaction. Nutrient scavenging, again, maybe the third time we've mentioned it, but if we have a rotation where we have an extended period of time where those fields are left bare, nutrients are really susceptible to loss, particularly nitrogen because it's water soluble. By planting a cover crop, they're going to pull up utilized nutrients for their own growth, and by allowing them to decompose in the field, they'll re-release those back into the soil. So if we're paying for nutrient inputs, this could be thought of as an improvement on our investment, just increasing the amount of time that we are getting a return from that investment. And the last one I'll mention here is nitrogen fixation. This is with legume cover crops. They can fixate nitrogen from the atmosphere and deposit in our soils. And if we're able to reduce our fertilizer inputs, this could be a significant cost savings. When we kind of lump these benefits together, think of the main mechanisms for how cover crops can improve our operation. I think there's three main takeaways. First is utilizing cover crops to enhance our resiliency. Improve the resiliency of our farms and fields to weather extremes like drought, heavy rainfall, and so forth. Also, reducing inputs. This should really be a focus with cover crops. How can you utilize them to reduce any costly inputs in your operation? This will improve their financial return in the long run. And then reduced environmental impacts. When we look at our farm, what sort of impact does it have to the surrounding ecosystems? We talked about things like nutrient scavenging, erosion prevention. By utilizing cover crops for those benefits, we can minimize or lessen the amount of negative impacts we're having to those surrounding ecosystems. This is why we see incentive programs for cover crops, agencies, private companies, and so forth willing to pay you to plant cover crops to generate these positive environmental outcomes. Now, it's not all sunshine and rainbows with cover crops. There are significant challenges. If you've heard me talk before, you might think, boy, this guy really focuses on the challenges. It's almost like he's trying to talk me out of cover crops. I assure you that's not my intent. I just think there's a lot of places for you to go and see, all the benefits, all the positives of cover crops, which I do believe in, but I'm also appreciate the fact that there are challenges that we'll have to face from a management perspective. I use the word challenge very deliberately because a challenge is something we can overcome. And we'll talk about these in more detail through the remainder of this presentation, but we just need to, anticipate or be aware of these challenges and think of how we can manage to minimize the ones we greatly want to avoid. First challenge we'll mention is cost. Probably not any way we can manage around this entirely. Cover crops cost money. And when we look at the benefits, a lot of them are hard to quantify or put into dollar and cents terminology. That means from the outside looking in, it might be hard to justify this cost to cover crops if I can't assign a dollar amount to the types of benefits that I'll be seeing. Could be some issues establishing the next cash crop. This is primarily for growers in a no-till conservation tillage type scenario, and you're going to have to be planting through that cover crop residue. Certainly one we can overcome, may require some practice, but if you're new to this, just appreciate this challenge and know it's something you probably need to take seriously. The green bridge refers to a scenario where our cover crop is host to some sort of pest, and it transfers that pest to the next cash crop and maybe create some economic loss. Volunteer establishment is when we don't properly terminate our cover crop or we allow it to reseed. This means it can come back or continue on and essentially function as a weed in our next cash crop and rob it of vital resources. Soil moisture, I said this was a benefit, now I'm saying it's a challenge. Well, this is with a living cover crop. Obviously, it's going to utilize soil moisture, and in a dry year coming into planting, this could be a big challenge. And the last one I'll mention here is nitrogen immobilization. Certain residues, cover crop residues, as they decompose, can create a temporary loss in available nitrogen that we may have to make up for with additional fertilizer inputs. Before we get into the actual decisions we'll be faced with regarding cover crops, I want to spend a second to talk about biomass. If you've watched other videos, listened to podcasts, you'll often hear people say biomass is the key to success with cover crops. You have to maximize your biomass to maximize your benefits and see greater return to your farm. And the reason for that is biomass is positively correlated to about all the benefits. So the more biomass we have, more likely we'll see those benefits at a significant level. Some benefits more than others. Something like weed suppression, nitrogen fixation, organic matter, pretty highly correlated, meaning we have to achieve a decently significant amount of biomass to see these benefits at a significant level on our farm. Other ones like nutrient scavenging, erosion prevention, even biodiversity, I would say, sure, more biomass is great, But we can still likely see these benefits at a pretty significant level, even with just modest cover crop growth. To kind of emphasize this, these are two NC State studies. The top one is looking at the suppression of small seeded summer annual weeds with cover crop residue, and found that 5,000 pounds of dry biomass per acre, that was really ideal for the suppression of these weeds. So you want to achieve that or something above. So that's a pretty significant target to achieve. This bottom one is a bit older, but it was looking at how much nitrogen a legume cover crop could contribute to our fields. And there are specific numbers with this if you want to look further into this study, but the take-home message is the more biomass we achieved with our legumes, the greater, amount of nitrogen that we were contributing to that next cash crop. On the flip side, I think you could argue that biomass is also positively correlated to a lot of the challenges. Things like cost, if we're bumping up our seeding rate in order to achieve more biomass. Something like nitrogen immobilization would potentially increase with the more biomass we have. And then we see, planting through that residue. We said this could be a challenge. It stands to reason that the more residue we have, the greater that challenge will be. And then you have challenges like soil moisture in the green bridge, which maybe only present themselves because we are waiting to terminate our cover crop closer to the planting of our next cash crop in order to allow for additional growth in biomass. So let's walk through some of these decisions and the considerations you need to make to come to the right decision for your farm. First question, do I plant a cover crop? Maybe the most important question of all. I don't think this needs to be at the farm level. I think you can ask this question field by field, maybe even acre by acre. You need to assess and think, can I take on this investment? And at what level can I take on this investment? That $37 per acre average seed cost, that's from a national survey. Can't emphasize the word average enough here. There was a huge variability with this. Some guys like $10 an acre, some people up to 50, so just know that it is a significant cost, but it can vary a lot. Think about additional costs, your equipment. Even if you're not purchasing new equipment, just wear and tear on your equipment, labor to, manage these cover crops, opportunity costs. Could you have planted something like winter wheat instead, and so forth? So think of all those costs and think of how much of that investment you can take on. Look at your fields, look across your farm and say, am I experiencing any issues that a cover crop can address? With these issues, are they creating expenses, revenue losses for you? And so can a cover crop help minimize these expenses or revenue losses? Thinking through this can maybe improve the financial return with cover crops if we know they are addressing a financially costly issue on our farm. And then the last thing to consider is, can you fit a cover crop in? Obviously with planting a cover crop and even terminating it, that can come at a pretty busy time of the year for a lot of farmers. So can you take on that additional work and to what extent? But also think, for the remainder of the year, do you have the time available to perhaps research, study, learn more about cover crops so you can best implement them for your farm? So you decide to plant. What species do you want to plant? Well, the list of species is growing every year, it seems, which is great for flexibility and options, but it can be a lot to sort through. So let's walk through some questions to help you narrow down this list. First, what are your goals? Sounds obvious, but have farm-specific cover crop goals. Different species accomplish different things. Make sure the species is helping to meet those goals. Another one that maybe seems obvious, but I don't think it's emphasized enough. What is your budget? Have a cover crop budget and make sure that species seed cost fits within that budget. What's your growing planting window, your rotation, and so forth? Look at your harvest schedules for whatever crop is preceding the cover crop and look at the recommended planting date for that species. Can you get it established on time? Also, just look at your overall rotation diversity and so forth and see if you can utilize cover crops to increase that diversity overall. How experienced are you with cover crops? Some species may be a little easier to establish than others. Generally, I think the ones you've heard more about are typically easier, so maybe stick with some of those and expand as you gain more experience. Do you have any ongoing issues that a cover crop can make worse? I have in parentheses host ability because the example I like to give is If you have root knot nematodes, don't plant a cover crop like red or crimson clover because it can host that nematode and make the problem worse. This is a pretty big question that maybe will require some time for you to sit and think through. Certainly reach out to your county agents, us here at Extension, to help you work through this. What are your field characteristics? Environmental characteristics, soil characteristics, and so forth. Different cover crop species obviously like different conditions. Just make sure the species you're planting will grow where you plant it before you plant it. And then lastly, monoculture or mixture. Mixtures are certainly growing in popularity. A lot of reason for this, multiple benefits at once, maybe additional benefits at once, more diversity overall. That's all great. That being said, we have seen, from a lot of studies that a well-performing monoculture can accomplish a lot, especially if you have a pretty limited set of goals. Say you're primarily focused on weed suppression. A monoculture cereal rye might be a better bet than a mixture for you. So no right or wrong answer there, just something to consider. So what can you do with these questions? That's, it's great you have them, but how can you work through them? Well, this tool, Cover Crop Selector tool, could be a great place to start. This comes from a group of researchers called Precision Sustainable Agriculture. These are people from different universities working alongside other groups like the Southern Cover Crops Council, which helps with the tool here in the Southeast. They develop all these tools we mentioned today come from them. They're all free, they're online, so that's great to know. But this tool will really help you narrow down the cover crop species you want for your farm and just learn more about different species overall. So you'll put in your specific state, your specific field location, tell it your cover crop goals, put in your cash crop growing window, and it's going to generate a list of species and show you how they perform for the different goals you told it. To the right of that, those dark green bars we see, those are the recommended planting date for those cover crop species based on your location. Pink bar is the cash crop growing window you told it. To the left of the screen, that filters panel, those are all drop-down menus. You can sort through, cross off species if they don't meet certain requirements for environmental tolerance, growth traits, and etc. If you click on the name of the cover crop species, this page pops up. A lot of good information on this page, what benefits that species can all help you accomplish, what challenges there are with that species, planting recommendations, and so forth. So I would strongly recommend checking this out. So you decide your species, how are you going to plant it? Well, most farmers are going to be able to answer this themselves. What practices are you already doing, what equipment you have, and so forth. Just a couple of quick comments on the different planting methods. When we look at drill or precision planters, those are going to oftentimes be the most consistent in terms of a cover crop stand, which is great, and often allow you to use the lowest seeding rate, so that can save you money there. But it is maybe additional equipment cost. It takes maybe a little bit longer to get cover crop planted, so there's some trade-off with that. Broadcasting can certainly save you a lot of time, especially in that part of the calendar. That time may be extremely valuable to you. If you're doing some sort of light incorporation after, that can improve results with broadcasting by getting some of that soil coverage. That being said, you still maybe want to bump up your seeding rates compared to a drill planter. If you're doing an incentive program, they're going to require you to increase your seeding rates likely quite a lot, sometimes as much as 20 to 50% depending on the species. And aerial broadcasting is growing in availability, maybe even popularity due to the onset of drones. Probably the least reliable in terms of a really good establishment with a cover crop, but a big advantage here is this can overcome a late harvest. Say you have a crop in there that you're just not going to get harvested in time to get the cover crop species planted by its recommended dates. Flying it on once that cash crop canopy opens up can be successful, and so it could be worth it for you to utilize this maybe less reliable method. Seeding rates. Obviously, these are going to vary, based on where you are, how you're planting them, and the species. When you look at recommendations, and I'll show you some resources where you can find these, just think the more localized that recommendation is to you, the better. Seeding rates is a really good example of needing to maybe do your own cost-benefit analysis to come up with the right call for yourself. There's a lot of maybe variability with seeding rates out there. When you look at, people like us at a university, we tend to use pretty high seeding rates in our study. The reason for that is these studies tend to last 1 to 3 years, and we're trying to see an impact within that 1 to 3 years. So we need to generate a pretty significant amount of biomass to, find a measurable impact. That being said, I know a lot of farmers that have done cover crops for 10, 15 years, and they're going at far lower seeding rates. Maybe they didn't see, as significant as an impact in those first couple years, but to them, they were more committed in the long term, and it was worth it, just to stay invested and keep that yearly cost low. So no right or wrong answer there. Just think of what works best for your situation. One caveat is if you are doing an incentive program, they will have their own seeding rates, and you're going to need to abide by them to stay eligible, and they're often on the higher side. So when should you plant your cover crop? Again, just look for more localized recommendations. I will again show you some resources for that here in a second, but sticking to these recommended dates, getting your cover crop established on time can be really crucial for success. When we look at planting a cover crop on time, it can improve success in a number of ways. It can improve maybe the short-term benefits, the really short-term benefits. So if this is a fall planted cover crop and we get it established on time, it achieves some decent fall growth, we're going to improve its ability to maybe fight winter weeds for resources. We're also going to improve its ability to prevent some late fall and winter erosion by having just better ground cover. But more so overall, we see planting by the recommended dates is really crucial for achieving a good amount of biomass with our cover crops. This study is from Minnesota, so to us here in North Carolina, these dates are way early. Don't let that throw you off. The take-home message is important. There's a reason I really like this study. You'll see at the end, but they had 4 planting dates for their cover crops. Within each planting date, they had 3 termination dates. We're not as concerned with that, just the planting dates. But we can see when they planted in mid-September compared to late September, they saw a bit of a drop in biomass with that later date. But I think what's really important is when they planted just a little bit later, October 8th, there was a very dramatic drop. So we can see, it can drop pretty quickly, when we get too late in the calendar year for how much biomass we can reach with our cover crops. Why I really like this study is they also planted pretty early September, maybe on the very front end of their recommended window or even a little bit before it. But, it didn't result in that significant of a return in biomass. So what does this mean? Maybe we don't have to kill ourselves to get our cover crop out there as early as possible, but just have a good idea of the recommended dates and, stick to that window, and that can really improve the results. Okay, so where can we get some of these rates and dates? Here is some resources. Cover Crop Selector tool has both. Seeding Rate Calculator is another tool from PSA. This can help you develop a cover crop mix. You can put in different species, develop a ratio for that mix based on the species and your preferences and so forth. NRCS has both rates and dates. Seed retailers can be great to talk to, especially about the specific varieties that they may be providing. And then other farmers. I think just across the board, other farmers are a great resource when it comes to how they have successfully implemented cover crops on their operation. So we planted the cover crop, it grew, that's great. Now we got to kill it. When we're looking at the termination method, just be aware that proper termination is really crucial to prevent that volunteer establishment challenge that we talked about. So when you're thinking of your method, think of what you're already doing on your farm, what you have experience with. If you're going to be utilizing a new method, maybe start small so you gain some good practice and can reliably kill or terminate that cover crop every year before you're doing it across the whole farm. A couple quick comments on the different methods. Chemical, if you're already doing a burn down, it doesn't get much simpler than this. This is really effective, can save you a lot of time and money, which is great. Just like any chemical application, consult the labels and experts for the best results. Moving into the more mechanical methods that can allow you to avoid chemicals if you so choose. These roller crimpers are growing in popularity. You want to kind of crease that cover crop to stop the flow of water and nutrients. You don't want to cut all the way through it as much as avoid that as much as you can, because that may allow for regrowth in the right settings. So this is going to require some practice. This is why if you're new to this type of method, start small on an acre or two, get it figured out before you implement it across the farm. Generally, sometimes, the early reproductive stage, right when it's going to reproductive stage, that's really ideal for this method, seems to have the better results. That's not a hard and fast rule, but just something if you could potentially do it at that time, that would maybe be the easiest. Now, any kind of roller type of scenario, some people spray and then roll because they want that residue nice and laid down on the ground. That can create some additional benefits. It might improve that residue's ability to suppress weeds later on in the growing season for that next cash crop. Also maybe improve soil moisture and keep soil temperatures cooler during those hot summer months. But if you're not used to planting through something like this, that can obviously be a challenge, which we already discussed. And we'll go through this in a lot more detail, how you can maybe overcome planting through that residue. Tillage, if you're utilizing tillage, it can certainly terminate a cover crop. Just make sure your equipment can dislodge the root entirely. When we incorporate, we may speed up decomposition of that cover crop. That can maybe speed up the rate at which it returns the nutrients that it scavenged, which could be a benefit, but we're losing that above ground residue and all the benefits that provided that we talked about in the previous slide. Mowing. Now, I will say I have not met anybody personally that relies on mowing for termination. I believe theoretically it could work if you mow really low to the ground during the reproductive stage. I don't know if I'd recommend it as a complete termination method right now, but people might mow cover crops for different reasons. I know some organic producers that will mow their cover crop and then follow it with tillage to terminate it. Generally, we recommend if you have a flail mower, that might be best because it more evenly distributes the residue and could be easier to work the next set of equipment through, so something to consider. And winter kill. The only reason I'm mentioning winter kill is because if you went home and Googled cover crop termination methods, winter kill is going to come up. So just want to say this is not a reliable method in North Carolina. I'm not saying it couldn't happen in the right year with the right weather and the right species. I'm saying don't rely on it, so have another termination plan. I'm sure most people would have known that. Probably everybody knew that, but I just want to state it. Okay, when you terminate your cover crop can significantly influence a lot of the benefits and challenges you experience. So we're going to walk through this. We're going to look at what's all influenced based on how close to the planting of that next cash crop we terminate that cover crop. First thing that might be influenced is biomass. Again, if you've watched other videos, listened to podcasts, you've maybe heard someone say delaying termination as late as possible is really important with cover crops because it allows for additional growth in biomass, and that means more benefits. Makes sense, right? Well, let's look at an NC State study and look at our specific location. So this study was done for 4 counties across 2 growing seasons. That gave us 8 total environments for comparison. I should say that gave them, I was not part of this study, 8 total environments for comparison. This was cereal rye planted before soybeans. So for half of the cereal rye, they terminated it 4 weeks before the planting of soybeans, and the other half they terminated at soybean planting. For 3 of 8 environments, they saw what you'd kind of expect. The later terminated cereal rye had significantly higher biomass, but that means for 5 of 8 environments, it did not. There was no significant difference in biomass whether they terminated that cover crop a month before soybeans or at soybean planting. So what's happening here? Well, most likely this is because we're in North Carolina. We have much milder winters and early springs. We can often reach certain stages of development much sooner in the calendar year with our cover crops compared to places like the Midwest. Generally, once a cover crop reaches reproductive stage, it's kind of maximized biomass. It's moving out of vegetative growth and transitioning to reproductive function. So here, it's 4 weeks out. Perhaps they're at heading stage somewhere in there. They now know they've probably maximized biomass. They may decide they want to delay termination for other reasons, but they now have the flexibility of knowing that sacrificing biomass doesn't have to be a consideration for them. So Definitely not a guarantee every year, for us, but certainly we're more likely to see this scenario compared to more northern climates, and it could be an advantage for our cover crop management. You'll need to consider some additional issues when you're thinking about when to terminate. The green bridge is a good one to start with. We mentioned this, but the closer we terminate our cover crop to the planting of the next cash crop, the more likely whatever's living in there is transferred to that cash crop. Now, whether that's a benefit or a positive is going to depend on what's all living in there. I've seen some studies where positive predatory insects were transferred. I've seen a lot of studies where pests were transferred. I've probably seen even more where there was a neutral impact. So what does this mean? Unfortunately, you probably are going to want to go out and scout and monitor your cover crop. Do a thorough job with this. If you see a pest or are concerned, terminate early. Our expert says 3 to 4 weeks before that next cash crop planting. That should be enough time to break this green bridge and greatly minimize this transfer. Carbon to nitrogen ratio could be, another important thing to consider when you're thinking of when to terminate your cover crop. This can be a complicated topic. You can also really get in the weeds with this. I don't know if that's entirely necessary. I just want you to have seen it and have a general idea of it and how it can maybe influence certain things with your cover crop. This is important because the microbes in our soil, they break down that cover crop residue. Their ideal diet has a carbon to nitrogen ratio somewhere around 20 to 1, 25 to 1, somewhere in there. So that means when you look at that residue, there's 20 parts carbon to every 1 part nitrogen that make up that residue. So any residue that they have to decompose from our cover crop that is above this ratio, something like 40 to 1, 50 to 1, it's going to take them much longer to break that down. If I'm leaving my residue on the surface for goals like weed suppression, something like that, hey, I like that. That's a big positive. On the flip side, we're likely going to experience something called nitrogen immobilization. So as they eat that residue, there's not enough nitrogen to meet their needs. So those microbes have to pull nitrogen from the soil for their own function. Whatever they pull out is temporarily unavailable for that next cash crop. It does work its way back in eventually, but generally not in a time frame that serves the needs of that next cash crop. If we're below this ratio with our residue, something like 10 to 1, 15 to 1, downside here is those microbes are going to decompose that residue relatively quickly, so we lose that benefit from the long-lasting residue. But on the positive side, we're more likely going to experience something called nitrogen mineralization. So as they eat that residue, there's more nitrogen than they need, and they can typically deposit it in the soil in a plant-available form, and it can help meet part of the nitrogen needs of that next cash crop. Be aware that a lot of factors can influence, how exactly you experience this and at what rate, things like weather, your soil types, and so forth. But just think of some things that we can manage for, when we're considering this aspect. You're likely not going to know your exact CN ratio, but just have an idea of how it can vary, first among species. Legumes, brassicas can tend to be more on the low side. Small grains, grasses can get higher. Generally, also, as a cover crop matures, that CN ratio is going to increase as well. Particularly when it hits reproductive stage, it can start to increase a lot. So going back to that cereal rye before soybean study, it's 4 weeks out. I'm at heading stage with my cereal rye, but I think, I really want long-lasting residue for better weed suppression during my soybean growing season. So I decide to let that cover crop ride. I'm going to terminate it later in hopes that CN ratio increases. Or maybe on the opposite. Maybe, I'm going into something like corn and I'm like, I want to minimize the amount of nitrogen immobilization that I'm experiencing from this cover crop. So I'm going to terminate as soon as possible. No right or wrong answer. It's going to depend on your goals and, that year and what crop you're going into and so forth. But just consider that when you're thinking of when you want to terminate. If you really want to get into this kind of issue, the immobilization, mineralization thing, this tool, the nitrogen calculator tool, again from PSA, this can really help you out. I will say maybe to utilize this tool to its maximum potential, you're going to need to do some sampling, tissue and biomass sampling at the moment. They are working on a development to maybe utilize cameras and stuff like that to make these estimates for you and make it a lot easier. It shouldn't be terribly much longer till it comes out, but at the moment you need to collect that information yourself. It's going to ask you for a decent amount of information, soil characteristics. These will be estimated based on a database they have. If you have more accurate information because a soil test you did, certainly put that in there. It's going to ask you questions about your cover crop, what species you planted when you terminated, biomass, and so forth. It's going to ask you about the cover crop quality. What is the chemical makeup of that cover crop tissue? And then, it's going to ask you about the cash crop, what species you're doing, when are you planting it, what's your yield goal, and how much nitrogen do you want to put on, and so forth. You feed it this information, it's going to show you two things. First, it's going to show you the nitrogen impact from that cover crop residue. So this top one here, this is cereal rye, high CN ratio cover crop. It's calculating that we'll experience nitrogen immobilization and see a nitrogen penalty of 13 pounds per acre because of that cover crop. Bottom one in this example is crimson clover, a lower CN ratio cover crop. It's calculating that we'll experience nitrogen mineralization and see a nitrogen credit of 48 pounds per acre that, is contributing to our next cash crop's nitrogen demand. It's also going to look at the residue. If we leave that residue on the surface, how long will it remain there? Top one, cereal rye, high CN ratio yet again, very slow, gradual decomposition. Crimson clover on the bottom, low CN ratio, you probably could guess, but it's a very rapid decomposition. Soil moisture is another thing you might want to think about when you're thinking of when you want to terminate. When we look at the residue, if we can leave that residue on the surface, we've seen from studies that can increase soil moisture later on in those summer months, and that could be a big benefit. But when the cover crop's alive, obviously it's utilizing soil moisture. In a dry spring, this can be significant. So terminate early. 3 to 4 weeks, yet again, is generally thought of as enough time to let that soil moisture recharge, but that's still going to be dependent on if we get some rainfall in that time frame. So I know people, when they're really concerned with this issue, they go much further out. So just adjust to it based on exactly how dry we are that year. This aspect could theoretically be a benefit during a wet spring. Say soils are really saturated, maybe it's an issue to get equipment in and so forth. A living cover crop drawing out that moisture could be a big benefit. So just something we have to adapt to every year when we think of when exactly we want to terminate. Now we're going to talk a little bit about planting after a cover crop, and this is going to primarily relate to people that will be planting through that cover crop residue. Definitely something with practice you can, really get the hang of. But if you're new to this, just be aware that it could create a challenge. And we've seen that in some studies. This was a study looking at cotton planted into a cereal rye cover crop. Cotton is particularly susceptible because it's a small seed at a shallow depth. And that residue getting in the way of the planter at all can, really throw that off. So that's the big issue here. They saw a decline in cotton emergence for 2 scenarios. One was when they planted into a standing cover crop. The other one is when they planted into a rolled cover crop, but that residue manager wasn't engaged on the planter. So these residue managers, unfortunately, it's an additional expense, but it's probably worth it because they can greatly minimize this challenge by moving that residue out of the way and allowing your planter to have better seed placement. A lot of options out there. Different companies selling these. I've been on a lot of farms. You see a lot of different setups, but it's worth investigating this and seeing if you can find a residue manager that can help you plant through that residue. One additional thing you probably want to consider with this, and especially when that relates to termination timing, is what state do you want that residue in when you plant through it? A lot of people say when it's really dry and brown, that's maybe easier to plant through. So that would mean terminate further out. That being said, I've talked to a lot of growers that have done this a long time, and they say, pretty fresh and green isn't really that much more challenging. What's really hard is when it's in that in-between stage. It's starting to decompose. It's rubbery, it's wet, still kind of green. That can be really challenging and an issue for the planter to work through. So just think through that, come up with an idea, try it 1 year on a couple acres, and then adjust from there based on what you see. Kind of just summarizing what we talked about with termination timing, the key take homes, because, this was a little bit of a longer topic, but we can really see, there's no right answer exactly, across the board when it comes to when exactly you should terminate. You're going to need to do your own sort of cost benefit trade-off analysis and determine what's right for you. A good example we gave is thinking about delaying termination to allow for the CN ratio to go up. Maybe that benefit of additional weed suppression is worth it to you and it's worth that trade-off of nitrogen immobilization, or maybe you're the opposite. It's going to vary for everybody. It's also going to vary based on the year and your rotation and so forth. So just work through that. Have a plan coming in, but it's important to be adaptable. We saw a lot of the things we mentioned are going to change year to year. What's the weather, precipitation that year? What growth stage is our cover crop at? And are we seeing anything in scouting, any pests that we are concerned with? In general, I will say the earlier you terminate, perhaps the less risk there is for some of these challenges, but potentially less reward, especially if you're sacrificing biomass. But also if you're leaving that residue on the surface and you terminate really far out, it's going to, decompose much sooner in the growing stages of that next cash crop, that maybe those benefits aren't as long lasting further into that cash crop. So just something to consider. I would say 2 to 4 weeks, more specifically 3 to 4 weeks, is perhaps one of the most recommended termination dates. So 3 to 4 weeks before you plant that next cash crop. Especially if you're new to this, probably a good place to start that first year. Adjust a bit if it's dry, you're seeing a pest, something like that. But see how that works and maybe adjust it from there. Okay, now maybe, the big question I think a lot of people ask with cover crops, maybe you've come to some talks, things like that, and you're looking for someone to give you some specific numbers on, what cover crops will cost and what kind of financial return they'll provide, and you don't get any, direct answers. Well, you're not going to get any direct answers today. And the reason is this is an extremely difficult question to answer. There is so much variability in potential costs and benefits with cover crops. Think of what we all just walked through. Everyone's answers are going to be different. That's, with those different answers, that'll create different costs and potentially different benefits. Also, what challenges are you addressing on your farm and what costs those have and so forth. That unfortunately, this requires pretty in-depth on-farm analysis to truly answer this question. 2 important things to remember when you look at the finances of cover crops. One is they are an investment. They are not a cost. Some of these results can take several years before we really start seeing them. If you did a 1-year cost-benefit analysis with cover crops, it might not make sense. So think of it as an investment. Also, a lot of these impacts, especially the ones relating to resiliency, we maybe don't feel until extreme years. We see a lot with long-term cover crop adopters. They've just had that improved resiliency, and in an extreme year, when there's something like drought, heavy rainfall, something like that, with that improved resiliency, they often take less of a yield hit compared to the conventional field. Now, great weather all year, that's fantastic. The conventional field maybe will yield the same, if not better than a cover crop field. But those extreme years, that's when these long-term cover crop adopters often see, the financial return to this practice. Some scenarios that maybe you are experienced or maybe could experience that could maybe improve the return to cover crops. If you have herbicide resistant issues, and you can utilize cover crops to help manage these weeds, that can be a big benefit financially. If you're grazing a cover crop, I'm aware that's not going to be a possibility for a lot of people. A lot of logistics there, but theoretically, if you could do it, it could really improve the return of cover crops. If you're charging somebody, that's a big revenue stream. If you own the livestock, that's a big savings for you. If you have issues with soil compaction, soil moisture, anything like that, that is causing you a yield hit, and cover crops can help lessen these issues and mitigate some of that yield hit, that's going to improve their return. High input costs, that's something we're seeing more and more of. If we can use cover crops to lessen the amount of these expensive inputs that we have to use on our fields, that can also improve the return. And then incentive payments. A lot of these programs, when we look at these incentive payments, there tend to be like 3 to 5 years, somewhere in there. When we look at surveys of long-term cover crop adopters kind of across the nation, we often see that same number come up, 3 to 5 years. That's how long it took them to really maybe start to see some of the benefits of cover crops and get to the point that they decided, hey, this is the right call for me. So these incentive programs, you don't have to do them, but they could be really beneficial to get you through that transition period to where you're starting to see some of the results. They may not cover the entire cost of cover crops, but they can certainly help a lot and, just make that transition period a little easier to bear. If you want to really understand how cover crops are impacting you financially, PSA has another tool that could really help. This is the Economic Decision Support Tool. Think of this as kind of your accounting software with cover crops. It's going to ask you for a lot of inputs. This may seem like a lot, but I believe it requires this level of analysis for us to truly understand how cover crops are changing our costs and revenues on our farm. You might not have all this information year one. Tell it what you can. It'll give you the best result it can. But if you're going to continue with cover crops, I would think about collecting anything that you don't have moving forward. So every year you have a better picture of how cover crops are impacting your wallet, and you can adjust your management accordingly. Couple closing comments. Hopefully you felt this was a valuable use of your time. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I'll provide my contact info at the end. This is primarily, going out to growers that are maybe thinking about cover crops, haven't done it yet. Some key points I want to mention. Two really important first steps. First, before you do anything, sit down and define your own goals with cover crops. What are you trying to get out of them for your farm? What challenges is your farm experiencing that you think a cover crop can address? Which of those cover crop challenges that we talked about do you really want to avoid or minimize because you think they'd be pretty detrimental to your operation? That's going to really guide your management and how you actually implement this practice in your farm. Another thing that could be important is finding a local mentor, another grower in your area that has a history with cover crops and has done so successfully. Us at Extension, we have a lot of great information and strongly recommend checking that out. But it is tough to beat real world, experience with cover crops, making them work in a commercial farm. So if you can find those contacts, it's definitely worth the time. We hit on this at first, but just want to emphasize it again. There's no one size fits all management plan with cover crops, unfortunately. You need to think of how you can develop your own specific management plan that is tailored to your farm circumstances to make it work the best. A couple more resources just to check out. NC State Soil Health Portal. Soil health in general, a lot of great information here, but they also have some info on cover crops. Southern Cover Crops Council, I mentioned them with the PSA decision support tools. This is a fantastic group that has a lot of great info on cover crops. If you want to learn more about PSA, check out their website there. Again, just want to highlight the cover crop portal, get more info on these topics and some others, and definitely check that out and let us know what you think. And lastly, want to provide my email address here. If you have any questions relating to this presentation, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to help. Hopefully, you enjoyed this and, makes it easier to think about how you could implement cover crops on your farm or maybe improve your management. Thank you.